Okay, welcome back, guys. We're going to continue with cardiovascular system blood or circulatory system as we're referencing it. So let's continue where we left off. Where we left off, we were talking about the composition of whole blood. Specifically, we mentioned how 55% of whole blood is going to be plasma, which 92% of plasma is just water, making plasma the liquid component of blood. Today, we're going to talk about formed elements. Specifically, we're going to prioritize a little bit more information relating to red blood cells. But before we get to that, let's just talk in general about formed elements. So the method in which we make formed elements is known as hemopoiesis. Now, hemo as a prefix, sometimes you may see it as another method that you may see it is written out as hematopoiesis. Same thing. Hemo or hemato means blood, whereas, just to change our color a little bit, the suffix poiesis is indicative of creation. So if you were to translate this literally, it would be blood creation, which is kind of what the definition is telling us. The cellular pathway by which the formed elements are produced. And if you recall from our last video, there are three formed elements: red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Now, how exactly do we do this? Well, we utilize special cells called stem cells. Stem cells are really interesting and fascinating, and they have quite a controversial past, especially in the 90s when there was a lot more push on research regarding stem cells. But these stem cells can turn into special versions of them called hemocytoblasts, which we don't need to dive too deep into that. There's entire courses learning about the science of stem cells. But these cells will divide and maturize and eventually create all three of these formed elements. So it's a pretty interesting process in which this method works. Let's continue onward. So let's talk about red blood cells. Let's talk about them. Red blood cells are also referred to as erythrocytes. I would make sure we know that. That's another name that you can call red blood cells. Erythro, as a prefix, means red. So erythro as a prefix means red. Cyte as a suffix, I've talked about this in other videos in the past. Cyte as a suffix means cell. So literally, if you were to translate this, it's red cells or red blood cells. Red blood cells make up 45% of whole blood volume. Wait a second. I mentioned how plasma makes up 55% of the whole blood, and now red blood cells make up 45%. 45 plus 55 is 100. So where's the white blood cells? Where's the platelets? They're there. It's just that it's not exactly 45%. It's more like 44.9 because red blood cells make up 99.9% of the formed elements. So the vast majority of formed elements that we observe are going to be red blood cells. And there's a reason for that, as we're going to discuss in today's video. Okay, moving on. Hematocrit, this is stuff that I just want to verbally discuss real quick with you guys. As far as hematocrit is concerned, it is sometimes referred to as a crit in a clinical sense. But the point of this is to analyze the blood and make sure that your blood is healthy. They can take a sample of your blood, like in a vial, and identify the percentage of everything. Percentage of whole blood taken up by formed elements. So they can identify what percentage of the blood is red blood cells, what percentage is white blood cells, what percentage is platelets. And if the numbers are accurate, that could be a good sign for someone's health. If the numbers are off, that could be indicative of something much worse. So it's a great way to tell, hey, is everything okay with the person's blood? Hey, we've seen this picture, right? That's where we ended in our last video, but now we've kind of flipped it. Now we're talking about the formed elements. Remember, formed elements make up 45% of the whole blood. Of that 45, 99.9% of it is going to be red blood cells. 0.1 is shared between platelets and white blood cells. So it's actually 0.05% for platelets and 0.05% for white blood cells. Again, you don't need a lot of white blood cells and platelets to do their job, so that's a good thing. You do need a lot of red blood cells, and again, we're about to discuss why in today's content. So what are the properties of red blood cells? What makes them so important and special? Number one, they're essential for transporting gases. Remember in respiratory system, we talked all about the gas exchange and all that fun stuff. Without a red blood cell, the gases don't make it to your cells. I think of red blood cells like a taxi cab. They pick up the oxygen and they take it across your entire body. So without it, the oxygen just can't make it far enough. So it works like a great transportation system. Specifically, the gas that it's going to help transporting is oxygen. Yes, it does transport some carbon dioxide, but if you remember our respiratory content, the vast majority of carbon dioxide is going to transport via the plasma as a form of bicarbonate. Another interesting trait about red blood cells, they lack most organelles. So they don't have as many organelles as a normal cell. Remember, an organelle, this is stuff you should have learned in biology, but an organelle is a small organ. So these are things like your mitochondria, your Golgi apparatus, your endoplasmic reticulum. So a lot of those things are not found in red blood cells. In fact, what's a very interesting trait about red blood cells is that they're the only cells in the human body that have no nucleus. No nucleus. So what's really fascinating about that is that because they have no nucleus, they have no DNA. And without DNA, the cell can't replicate, right? It can't go through mitosis. So red blood cells actually don't replicate. The stem cells that make red blood cells do replicate. It's kind of a loophole, if you want to call it that. All these organelles that are missing, it's just making room for a particular protein called hemoglobin, which is very important. And we're going to talk about that in just a couple slides. Red blood cells typically live up to 120 days, aka about 4 months. That's their lifespan. So after about 4 months, they typically degrade, they die, and that's all they got. But there's a pretty interesting process in which they recycle and we reuse whatever components we can. So let's take a look at what we are talking about here. So let's erase this stuff real quick. Here we can see a red blood cell in a different formats, right? In letter A, this would be like using a typical microscope that you would see in a classroom setting. So like maybe this is a 60 times magnification, if that. Letter B would be like an electron microscope. It's not normally colored. It would be something that you'd have to use a computer to do. But an electron microscope can see things with much higher fidelity. You'd have to find these at like universities and labs and things like that. Letter C is obviously a computer rendition, but it just shows us what a red blood cell looks like. They're these donut-shaped cells, pretty basic cells overall. If you're wondering what this measurement is, in science, they use the metric system, right? So meters, but that's Greek for micro, which micro, if you're not familiar, is 10 to the negative 6. So that's a terrible 6. Hold on. 10 to the negative 6. There you go. So it's 6 zeros in front of the first number. So that's very, very small. And obviously that's expected, right? They're cells after all. So let's talk about that hemoglobin stuff. Why is it so important? First of all, hemoglobin makes up 95% of your red blood cell protein. So the vast majority of a red blood cell is just going to have a ton of hemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin is made up of 4 compounds. That's what we observe here. A globin, which it's in the name. We don't need to dive too deep into what globin exactly is. Heme, which is something we typically consume, especially from meats and things of that nature. Iron. This one we really need to focus on. Iron is going to be the binding element. And if you've taken chemistry before, you should already know this anyway. But iron is going to be the binding element that attaches to oxygen. And on the periodic table of elements, iron is Fe. I'll just make sure we're comfortable with that. So iron is the element or the metal that attaches to oxygen. And it turns out, like I said, if you've taken chem, you've probably learned this. Metals bind really well to gases. They react really well. So for us and many other land creatures, we use iron as our oxygen acceptor. Iron is one of the key parts of hemoglobin because it attaches to the oxygen itself, and then it'll travel through the red blood cell around the body, and then it deposits the oxygen where it needs to go. Very, very important. People that are anemic, meaning they have low levels of iron in their blood, this could be problematic for them where they have low levels of energy, not enough oxygen supplementing their body. And it's not necessarily a breathing problem. It's not a respiratory issue. It's more of a blood problem at this point. Now, the good news is you can just change your diet a little bit. You can also take iron supplemental like pills, and that could help out too in those circumstances. And there's other ways around it for sure. Now, fun fact, this is just some stuff that I think is interesting. It has to do kind of with like one of my favorite animals. I mentioned how land animals are primarily using iron, right? Other creatures, like aquatic creatures, and I'm not talking about dolphins or whales because those are mammals, but other aquatic creatures use other metals. So for instance, one of my favorite animals, an octopus. I think it's octopuses, if I remember reading correctly, the grammar of the plural of it. Octopuses, when they bind to oxygen, and squid are similar to this as well, and some crustaceans, they use magnesium. Magnesium is a different metal, and when it binds to oxygen, it creates a blue color. So that's really fascinating. We have this red blood because of iron, that when iron binds to oxygen, it creates this red color. Other creatures create this blue color because of other metals. Now, here's what I was mentioning earlier. We don't need to learn all of this necessarily. This is a lot, but this is just emphasizing that when we create those red blood cells through the bone marrow, right, those cells are going to circulate through your body for roughly 4 months. When they get old, we have these special white blood cells we're going to learn in a future video called macrophages. Those macrophages are going to destroy the old blood cells and secrete that iron and send the iron back to the bone. The bones are then going to use it to make new blood cells. It's a perfect recycling system. We are very, very efficient, for sure. Efficiency is very big for our body. And then apart from that, the stuff that we don't need any longer, so the remnants of heme get broken down, and the liver will convert it to bilirubin, as you see here, and manipulates the bilirubin so that you can excrete it through urine and feces. So it's a pretty good system. Erythropoiesis, not too much to be said about erythropoiesis, but the biggest thing that we need to comprehend is, so I'm just going to start this real quick. It is the process of formation for red blood cells. Remember, erythro means red, poiesis means creation. And obviously this occurs in the bone marrow, but the biggest thing we need to know is that the word erythro as a prefix does not equal hemo. Hemopoiesis, as I mentioned earlier in this video, is the creation of any blood cell, which includes red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Erythropoiesis is strictly the creation of red blood cells. Do not get confused on that. You're going to see some questions associating to that later on in this particular unit. Don't need to worry about all the complexities of this. This is simply showing us that you have the stem cells, which are these hemocytoblasts, when they're communicating with these different genetic codes, which you may learn that in future classes in college potentially. When they communicate with these genetic codes, it activates the stem cell and converts the stem cell into the stuff we're learning: red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Finally, to conclude, we need to learn this step-by-step process. So let's go through it step by step. Number one, I'll just keep it all on this one right here. Number one, this organ right here that looks kind of like a bean, that's your kidney. So that's your kidney. We have 2 kidneys, right? You can live with 1, by the way, as we're going to learn in urinary system. So the very first step of this whole cycle is right here. Number 1. Your levels of oxygen in your kidney go down. When the levels of oxygen in your kidney go down, the kidneys are going to secrete a protein, which is step 2. And I'm going to star this because this is really important. Your kidneys are going to secrete a protein called erythropoietin, EPO. What does EPO do? EPO circulates through the bloodstream and it reaches the bone. Specifically, it targets the bone marrow, and it tells the bone marrow we need new cells stat. So the bone marrow is going to create those stem cells, right? Increase the level of mitosis, which is growing new cells, and also accelerate maturation. It makes it mature even faster. That is going to lead to step 4, which is what we see here, which is an increased number of red blood cells now in the blood. And finally, because you have an increased number of red blood cells, we reach stage 5, you increase the level of oxygen in the blood, thus increasing the level of oxygen in the kidneys. There's technically a stage 6. I just don't have it written down. The stage 6 in this context would be because your levels of oxygen rise up in the kidneys, you don't need any more EPO. So you stop secreting it. This whole process is referred to as the EPO cycle. This is stuff we definitely need to know for sure. And this, we're learning it because it's involved with blood, but this is also an example of negative feedback. That's stuff that we're going to learn in endocrine system, which funny enough, I have those videos already recorded since that was quarter 4 content from last school year. But that is stuff that is going to be super relevant to the endocrine system, the feedback loops, positive and negative feedback. This is just an example of what we call negative feedback. So we'll talk more about that as we progress. We're not in endocrine right now, so we don't need to dive too deep into that. For now, I just need you to understand that your kidneys play a major role in helping you raise your oxygen levels when your oxygen levels get dangerously low. All right. So I think that's a great place for us to stop. Thanks for tuning in, guys. I'll see you guys on the next one.